Hello, I'm Karen Long, President and founder of Streamline Government Contracts. Streamline helps small to mid-sized government contractors who seek experienced, effective support with contract management that will reduce your risks, increase your profits, and enhance your reputation. We do this by negotiating TAs, subcontracts, preparing estimates of completion when necessary, and speaking to contracting officers in their own language. We are the proud organizer of Government Contractor Chats and appreciate you joining us today. Now we'll turn it over to Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Government Contractor Chat. My name is Lindsay Riegelsberger, Operations Manager and Marketing Specialist for Streamline Government Contracts. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker now. Rich Wilkinson is a director in the Product Marketing Group at Unanet, a leading provider of project ERP software for professional services firms, which specializes in the GovCon space. Without further ado, here's Rich.
Welcome, everyone, to this morning's presentation on GovCon trends in labor and fringe cost. It's a really interesting time to be in this particular industry. A lot of things are happening, and that's not particularly normal for government contracting. Today, first we'll talk a little bit about the basic labor laws and how they affect us as GovCons. But we'll spend most of our time talking about some of the current issues that are taking place right now in wage and hour law. When we're done with all of those, we'll talk a little bit about the outlook for 2023 for the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, because things are changing there slowly, as almost always happens with GovCon, but they are changing. And finally, we'll wind up with a small but slightly disturbing trend in fringe rates that we uncovered during our annual government contracting survey. Let's start with some of the basic labor laws that affect us as government contractors. The basic statutes certainly haven't changed. Look at the dates on these things. The most recent one is 1965. That thing's over 50 years old. And the others are even older than that by another 30 years. We'll start with the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act we're all familiar with. FLSA established the minimum wage and controls entitlement to the minimum wage. It also established the 40-hour work week. And one of the more important things right now, the Fair Labor Standards Act controls overtime entitlement. Who gets it, how much they get, and the rules around when they're entitled to it and when they're not. It also controls the classification of employees as employees or independent contractors. And this one has kind of been a pretty significant issue for the last couple of years, less so in government contracting in the commercial world. In the commercial world, what they refer to as the gig economy has kind of taken over certain sectors, like transportation of individuals. Lyft and Uber have almost completely supplanted taxi services in many of our larger cities. And those services don't use employees for the most part. They use independent contractors. Uber and Lyft drivers are not employed by Uber or Lyft. They're independent contractors who supply their own tools and equipment, determine their own work hours, accept or reject tasking, and so forth. But some of the issues around that are changing pretty rapidly. The second one is the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act. And this one, even though it actually was enacted 2 years before the Fair Labor Standards Act, this is the one that actually makes the Fair Labor Standards Act applicable to all federal contracts over $15,000. You might ask yourself, doesn't the Fair Labor Standards Act already apply? And the answer is, well, not exactly. Fair Labor Standards Act applies primarily to companies engaged in interstate commerce, and it doesn't apply outside the United States. So if you're doing work for the government, for example, and you're doing it in a foreign country, the Fair Labor Standards Act would not apply. The Walsh-Healy Public Contract Act does, and it makes the Fair Labor Standards Act rules apply no matter where you're doing the work and whether that work is considered interstate commerce or not. So as a government contractor, we can't escape the rules of the Fair Labor Standards Act no matter what we're doing or where we're doing it. The Service Contract Act is the one that's the most recent being very relative term right here, 1965 for the Service Contract Act. The SCA creates wage floors by labor category. And there are a couple very significant rules around that. First of all, Service Contract Act does not apply to everything. It only applies when the government determines that the primary purpose of a contract is the furnishing of services. And that determination, by the way, is not made by the contracting officer. That determination is made by the Department of Labor in an independent review of the statement of work before the solicitation ever goes out. So the rule in SCA is if your contract has the clause in it, it applies. If it doesn't have the clause in it, then the SCA does not apply to that contract. It's very simple. You either have the clause in the contract, in which case you come under the SCA rules, or you don't, in which case you don't. Davis-Bacon, we're not going to touch on very much. It's really the Service Contract Act for construction, even though it was enacted 34 years before the Service Contract Act. It came into being first, and then the Service Contract Act followed it 34 years later to apply the similar rules to services as the Davis-Bacon Act applied to construction. The only thing the Davis-Bacon Act really does that SCA does not is it has a requirement in it for something called a certified payroll. Davis-Bacon requires that payroll for under contracts that have the clause in it be paid weekly, and they have to be certified to the contracting officer, and a report goes to the contracting officer of who got paid and how much was deducted and so forth. SCA does not have those kinds of rules. There are also a couple executive orders that impinge on us as government contractors. And you can see them on the screen here. There's one establishing a minimum wage for contractors. That one was actually issued during the Obama administration, and it phased itself in over time. However, there's been a significant change to that in the Biden administration that has significantly raised that minimum wage, and there was no phase-in in President Biden's executive order. It applied when the executive order was issued. The other one is establishing paid sick leave for federal contractors, and this one has a couple unusual aspects to it that are really not very well understood by a lot of us. That one was also originally issued under the Obama administration and is still into effect. Everyone expected the Trump administration to rescind both of these executive orders, but neither one was. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the Department of Labor and their responsibilities. The Department of Labor has a division within it called the Wage and Hour Division. The Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor audits all labor laws and executive orders pertaining to wage and wage payment and hours, not DCAA. If DCAA comes in and audits your organization and discovers, incidentally, by the way, because they don't go looking for these things, but if they discover something that they consider to be a potential violation of a labor rule or law, they will refer that to the Department of Labor, but they do not audit or investigate that themselves. The Department of Labor's wage and hour people, by the way, are not considered auditors. They are investigators because they are technically law enforcement people, not auditors. and they have subpoena power. They literally carry a pad of subpoena forms around with them when they do labor law investigation, and they can sit down, write out a subpoena, and hand it to you, and it has the force and effect of law. Let's talk a little bit in detail about those current issues. Now, things in GovCon change on a geologic timescale. They don't exactly change rapidly. I've heard it said that crustal plates on the Earth's surface move faster than GovCon, and sometimes it seems like that's true. However, another thing is true that could be used in this in the same analogy. When crustal plates finally do move, it's called an earthquake, and everything shakes, and some of the things we've built fall down. And the same thing happens with GovCon. For years and years and years, nothing happens. It doesn't seem like anything's ever going to happen. Nothing's going to change. And then all of a sudden, there's a little bit of an earthquake, and things shake, and there's a new normal afterwards. And sometimes some of the things we've built, like contract structures and payment methods and so forth, fall down, and we have to rebuild them. One of the things that has happened very recently with the Fair Labor Standards Act is a Supreme Court decision issued February 22nd, 2023. This thing's not even a month old. It was styled as Helix Energy Solutions Group versus Hewitt. And the Supreme Court held in that decision that you cannot pay someone a daily rate and call it a salary. Now, this particular case came up with workers on an oil rig. They were paid a daily rate when they were on the oil rig and working. But even if they were on the rig and not working, they were not paid. So they could have a day off. They did not get paid for that day off, even though they were on the rig and subject to being called up at any time. But they were paid a daily rate for a full day's work on the rig. Helix called that a salary. The Supreme Court, in their decision, said no, that is not a salary. It doesn't matter how much they made, because Helix said, hey, these guys are very, very well paid. Their compensation, I think it was over 200, in the last sentence on the slide, equivalent to more than $200,000 a year. That surely they meet the highly compensated employee test of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Supreme Court said no, does not matter how much they're paid. You could pay them $1 million a year, and it wouldn't make any difference because you're not paying it on a salaried basis. So if you can imagine for a moment, someone making $200,000 a year, and they worked, by the way, 12-hour shifts for at least 5 days a week. So every single day they worked, they were getting 8 hours of regular time and 4 hours of overtime. And the Supreme Court said yes, in fact, they were entitled to overtime, and the company had to pay them time and a half for all the hours over 40 in a week. You can imagine how expensive. Now, we don't operate a lot of oil rigs in GovCon. What we do is we deploy people overseas, and some of the people we deploy overseas, we elect to pay on a daily rate when they are working, and not pay them at all when they are not working. That daily rate we have sometimes considered to be a salary. And remember, no matter where they are, the Walsh-Healy Public Contract Act brings them under the FLSA rules of FLSA. So the Fair Labor Standards Act applies, even though they're not within the continental United States. They could be in the sandbox, they could be in South America, they could be in the Arctic. Does not make any difference because of the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act. And if you're paying them a daily rate, that's fine. Just understand that that makes them non-exempt. You should probably talk to your HR department, and maybe even a good labor law attorney about what that means for your particular company and your particular circumstances. Keep in mind that this is very definitely an emerging situation. It is very recent. Your HR departments and your attorneys may not be up to date on this yet. Introduce them to the concept, tell them about the decision, ask them what this might mean for you. Because the last thing you want is to get blindsided by something like this one. The second pretty significant finding, and this is also associated with the Fair Labor Standards Act, has to do with whether an individual is an employee or whether they are acting as an independent contractor under the rules of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The notice of proposed rulemaking was issued in October last year. They are targeting the publishing of the final rule in May of 2023. So we've got about 8 weeks somewhere out there before we see the final rule on this. Fair Labor Standards Act includes the rules. Now, in the past, this has been predominantly audited or controlled or at least monitored by the IRS, because the IRS has a substantial interest in whether you consider someone to be an employee and give them benefits and pay payroll taxes, or whether you consider them to be an independent contractor and leave all the tax and benefit issues up to the individual. One of the things this final rule is expected to change is who's going to be the primary on these investigations and this monitoring. And it looks like it's going to be primarily the Department of Labor. Of course, Department of Labor's primary concern is that people are properly classified. And if they are classified as an employee, they are getting the appropriate benefits and pay, and the company is paying the appropriate payroll taxes. And if they are classified as an independent contractor, they are not, in fact, a de facto employee. Now, you can still expect the IRS to be looking over everybody's shoulder because they're very concerned with collecting back payroll taxes if an employee is misclassified as an independent contractor. But the Department of Labor is also going to be investigating these things, and they will make referrals to the IRS whenever they find what they think is a potential misclassification of individuals. And the audits or investigations will often proceed jointly with the IRS and the Department of Labor. Now, I can't think of any two departments I less want to have looking over my shoulder than those two. But it could happen, and it could happen in relatively near term. I'm going to stop for just a second and tell you a personal story. I'm going to leave some of the names out to protect the innocent and the guilty. Some 25 years ago, I was working for a company, and I had a facility in Pensacola, Florida that came under my management. And in that facility, we were doing work for the Navy. It was a very large contract. We employed about 150 people. We had another dozen people who were subject matter experts. These people were highly educated, and we didn't really need them all the time, but when we did need them, they worked pretty much full time. And the work they were doing was classified. We treated them as independent contractors. We gave them a 1099 at the end of the year, not a W-2. It was quite a substantial amount of money that we paid these people on that 1099 every year. But about 2 years into this contract, one of those 1099 individuals passed away. And his widow decided that she needed to explore the classification of this individual, whether they were properly classified as an independent contractor or whether they were, in fact, a de facto employee. The IRS was all over it. The Department of Labor also got involved, even back then. And if you remember the guidelines then, if the individual furnished all their own tools, if they set their own schedule, if they had the profit and loss incentive, if they had multiple customers for their services, they were properly classified as an independent contractor. But if the employer provided all the tools, if the employer set all of the work hours and workplaces, and the employer did all the other things and supervised the individual, then that person might be considered to be an employee. Well, this is classified work. It had to be done inside a restricted area in our facility. Obviously, they couldn't work at home. They couldn't work pretty much anytime they wanted to. They had to work during hours when our security officer was available to check them in, check them out, check out classified materials to them and check them back in. And we provided all the tools, namely the computers, the software, all the things required to do classified work on these contracts. You can see where this is going. The IRS decided that they were employees, not independent contractors. We had to pay a lot of back payroll taxes. We also had to pay back benefits to the individuals to compensate for the benefits they did not get because they were not employees, not classified as employees at the time. And the deceased individual was also paid the benefit of life insurance they would have had as an employee. And we, of course, had to pay that out of pocket. Not a pleasant experience, not something I ever want to go through again, and I don't think you do either. The current rule is still based on those 5 factors: opportunity for profit or loss, the nature and degree of control, namely work hours and workplace, the degree of permanence of the work relationship. Is it short-term? Do they have multiple customers? Or is there one relationship that continues until it doesn't? And in most places, government contractors, most of the places government contractors work are at will employment states. And so the relationship goes on until the employee is terminated. Is the work considered an integral part of the employer's business? Namely, are we using this individual because we really need them, or is it an occasional work? And finally, skills and initiative. All of these things are important, but the first 2, opportunity for profit or loss and nature of the control, are considered core factors. Those 2 pretty much override everything else. The new rule adds an additional 6th factor, namely whether the individual is economically dependent on the employer. In other words, does that check that the individual gets, are they dependent on that to pay the rent, to pay their mortgage, to feed their family, provide their insurance and everything else? Or could they take or leave the check that they get? For most of us, the answer to that one is going to be, yeah, I'm economically dependent on this company that's paying me this amount of money. This particular test is going to make it far easier for the Department of Labor or the IRS to determine that this person is a de facto employee. Watch the Federal Register carefully. If you subscribe to HR publications from organizations like the Society for Human Resources Management, SHRM, or organizations like that, and if you don't, maybe you should sign up for 1 or 2 of those and monitor the situation pretty carefully, because when this final rule does get published, it will probably be effective that day. By the way, we do tend to use a lot of 1099s or independent contractors in the government contracting business. I wouldn't say it's predominant. We do not have the situation that Lyft and Uber has, where almost their entire workforce are 1099s. But we use enough of them that we wouldn't want to accidentally get any of them classified as employees. It could be expensive. I put this one in here, and I'm not going to plow through all of these one by one. I put them in here so that you would have a reference to these. You will be given the opportunity to download a copy of this presentation when it's finally delivered. And this particular slide could be a valuable checklist for individuals that are perhaps about whose status you're uncertain. Yeah, I've already mentioned what happened in my situation when we had these individuals that were misclassified according to the IRS and the Department of Labor. By the way, the IRS took the lead on that particular investigation. Department of Labor just sort of chimed in at the end with a consent decree that we had to sign. Liability for back payroll taxes, interest, and penalties. The IRS doesn't assess you anything looking backwards without putting interest and penalties on it. You probably already know that. The back payroll taxes were pretty expensive. By the way, you might expect if they hit the employer up for payroll taxes for a period during which the employee or the individual was treated as an independent contractor, you might expect the IRS to refund the self-employment taxes they paid for that period. Nope, doesn't happen. They just keep them both. Potential liability for benefits that they would have received as an employee and did not. That one can get reasonably expensive, particularly considering the cost of life insurance, health insurance, 401k contributions, all those kinds of things. And all of those would be paid to these individuals in cash for the period they were misclassified. And consequential damages, and that's what I was talking about with the individual that passed away. The consequential damages were the life insurance benefit that they would have received from the insurance company if they had been an employee, but did not because they were classified as an independent contractor. We ended up having to pay that out in cash. By the way, when the federal government ends the public comment period, that doesn't mean that they're going to just publish the existing interim rule as a final rule. They could change things. And if you have not responded during the comment period, you might consider doing that. Look them up in the Federal Register. If you have a comment that you think is germane, go ahead and provide it. That can, and I have seen it in the past, significantly change the final rule when it's finally issued. Secondly, the final rule could be challenged in court, and we could see the same situation that we did with OSHA's COVID-19 vaccination rules, where there were contradictory rulings. There was one ruling out of California, another out of New York, another one out of Texas. They contradicted each other. There was massive confusion. The proposed rule, as it currently stands, I've given a link there for the Federal Register. You'll be able to download this presentation with that link in it when it's delivered, and then you can go in and look at those, the interim rule. And if you choose, you can provide comments to that interim rule. By the way, this change in classification of employees is one of the more significant changes that's happened in labor law in the past 50 years. So it's worth monitoring, reading about, and it's worth making a comment just to add your voice to the chorus, if nothing else. There really isn't anything new in Walsh-Healy, because Walsh-Healy doesn't do much except extend the reach of the Fair Labor Standards Act for government contractors. There's not much new on the Service Contract Act or the Davis-Bacon Act, except Department of Labor is significantly staffing up their wage and hour division, and that is increasing the likelihood of being audited. By the way, when the Department of Labor comes in to audit any government contractor with respect to the Service Contract Act, they will have a finding. It may be minor, it may be insignificant, but in my 45 years in government contracting, I have never seen a Service Contract Act investigation by the Department of Labor that did not have a finding of some kind. Service Contract Act investigations, needless to say, are to be avoided at all costs. Let's talk about those two executive orders because both of them, in fact, are becoming pretty significant. And again, the responsibility for monitoring and enforcing these falls on the Department of Labor. The first one, establishing a minimum wage for government contractors, set the minimum wage at $10.10 an hour to be paid to any contract employee working on a federal contract. And that went into effect as of 1/1/2016. So we're looking at 7 years, more than 7 years ago. The other one, establishing paid sick leave for federal contractors, will create a new entitlement for paid sick leave working on a federal contract as of 1/1/2017. I should have changed that to did create or created a new entitlement because that's long since passed. Now, both of these were phased in. Let's talk about the sick leave one first. Establishing a paid sick leave for federal contractors, that was new, but it only applied to new contracts arising out of solicitations issued after 1/1/2017. That gave it a pretty significant phase-in period because solicitations are often issued in the spring. We write proposals in the summer. They're evaluated in the late summer, early fall for a 1 October award. Many contracts are multiple year. So if the contract had just been awarded, it might be 3, 4, 5 years before there was a follow-on contract, and this finally came into effect for that portion of the workforce. The provisions of it are pretty significant. It provides for 7 days of paid sick leave per year for full-time employees, but the way the entitlement is stated is kind of interesting. It's different than I've ever seen in federal law before. It's 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours worked. And it makes no distinction between part-time, full-time, or anything else. It's 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours worked. Now, if you divide 30 into 2080, you end up with about 7 days a year. But if you only worked 10 hours a week, after 3 weeks, you'd be entitled to 1 hour of sick leave. So it really applies to everyone. You can limit accruals, but you cannot limit it to any number less than 56 hours. So you still end up with about a 7-day a year entitlement for a full-time employee. It carries over from year to year. And if an employee leaves and comes back within 12 months, you have to reinstate any balance that was lost. This is not paid out upon termination. Employees that leave forfeit any unused sick leave. Any leave required under this executive order is in addition to the obligations under the Service Contract Act and Davis-Bacon Act. In fact, if you look at a recent Service Contract Act wage determination, the sick leave is a separately stated requirement. So it's in addition to vacation or holidays stated in the SCA wage determination. The sick leave is over and above that. It only applies to workers on Service Contract Act and Davis-Bacon Act contracts. Let's talk about this for a second because there's a temptation to say, okay, I have a contract with the Service Contract Act. I employ 60 people under that contract, but only 2 of them are non-exempt and therefore come under the wage determination. That's fine. But the executive order doesn't say anything about wage determination. It says employees who work on services contracts. Every employee that works on that services contract is entitled to that sick leave accrual. That has already tripped up a few contractors. It will continue to trip up a few more as we go through time. If you assume that only people who are subject to the wage determination on the contract get the sick leave, check with your HR department. check with a good labor law attorney. Make sure you're on solid ground there. I'm not providing any legal advice. I am telling you that some government contractors have already had to go back and give people sick leave that was not provided. So just advice to the folks that are listening. The second one actually has more concern for me than the first one. The minimum wage for contractors executive order was issued in 2014 and established $10.10 per hour as the minimum wage to be paid to any contractor employee working on a federal contract. Notice there are no qualifications. Doesn't have to be a service contract, doesn't have to be a service employee, doesn't have to be within the continental United States. It can be anywhere, any employee, anytime. If you're paying someone on a federal contract, you have to be paid $10.10 per hour or more. One of the very first executive orders issued by the Biden administration, by the way, that $10.10 an hour was annually adjusted, and it creeped up 10 cents one year, 20 cents the next year, and it looked like it was on its way to $11 when the Biden administration came in, and one of the very first executive orders issued by the Biden administration was to increase the minimum wage to $15. On September 30th, 2022, Department of Labor published a notice in the Federal Register increasing the minimum wage to $16.20, effective January 1st, 2023. So that has already happened. The minimum amount you can pay any federal contract employee is $16.20, and that went into effect more than 2 months ago. On January 6th, 2023, this stuff is very recent. The $15 rate, which was challenged in court, was upheld by the District Court for the District of Arizona and determined to be not only allowable, but constitutional. There is no question in my mind that the $16.20 will also be challenged. I'm also pretty sure that given the precedent, that one's going to be upheld as well. I want to point out that the current Fair Labor Standards Act highly compensated employee threshold is about $17.10. It's $684 a week on a salaried basis. If you extend that out to a year and divide by 2080, it comes out to about $17.10. In fact, it comes out to exactly $17.10. The new minimum wage is $16.20. It's only 90 cents short of the exemption threshold for salaried employees. With the next adjustment, especially if inflation continues to increase over the next year, as it has in the last year, we can expect the new minimum wage on federal contracts to exceed the Fair Labor Standards Act highly compensated employee rate of $17.10. Very bizarre situation. So, a lot of these things tend to sort of slide by us like water under the bridge because the the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Administration has been a little bit hamstrung for the last couple of years. They have struggled to recruit new investigative staff. They fell short of their goals in 2022, and wage enforcement actually declined for the fourth consecutive year. But they did have slightly more investigators on board, though still in training. At the end of fiscal 2022, 810 versus the 782 the same time of the previous year. And the division has been promised funding for an additional 100 new investigative hires in fiscal 2023. Now, the budget for fiscal 2023 is still an open question, whether the budget will be there for that or not. However, the Biden administration has made funding support for the Wage and Hour Division a priority within the Department of Labor's budget. So even if the Department of Labor's budget gets cut, it's likely the Wage and Hour Division will get the additional funding they need for the new hires. The lead time on that, on new hires in the Wage and Hour Divisions, is roughly a year. It takes about that long to get new investigators trained and in the field doing productive work. So we have a little running room. And that's a good thing considering all of the new things that are happening in wage and labor law. But we need to be on top of these things and monitoring the situation to make sure we don't have anything in our wage and hour policies that's going to get us to make us fall afoul of the rules. I'm going to shift gears on you a little bit. We all know what fringe costs are, and all of us in the government contracting world have a fringe pool, or at least a pool that includes fringe costs. The fringe pool for government contractors has three primary components, and the base for fringe is almost always salaries and wages. First segment of fringes is payroll taxes, FICA, FUTA, SUTA, all the things that you have to pay the government just for the privilege of having an employee. And that ranges from 10 to 11.5%, depending basically on the tax jurisdiction. If you are in Massachusetts or New York or California, there are local and state payroll taxes that are pretty significant. If you're in other states, they tend to be less. So it can vary a little bit. Paid absence is the second largest component of the fringe rate, and that ranges from 8 to 10%, depending primarily on how much competition there is for new hires. By the way, there is a lot of competition right now to recruit new hires in GovCon. In fact, in this year's Gauge survey and report, Gauge is a survey that we conduct annually. Unanet does that in conjunction with one of our CPA firm partners, CohnReznick. We take the results of that survey and we analyze the survey responses to the survey questions and turn it into a report. In the most recent report, recruiting and retention were the two number one issues for the C-suite, the CEO, CFOs, COOs of the companies. They were the most important issues for the HR departments. They were the most important issues for project managers, especially project managers trying to staff a new contract. So vacation, sick, holiday has tended to stay higher, even though there is cost pressure on other elements of fringe. The third element, where all the pressure is happening, is direct benefits. Now, if you ask most employees what do they get as benefits, they're going to give you a list of things they get from their company that they consider benefits. Let me give you a little clue. Payroll taxes is not going to be on that list. Most employees simply don't consider payroll taxes to be a benefit. They will usually include vacation, sick, and holiday in that, but the rest of that benefit list is going to be things like health insurance, life insurance, 401k contributions, long-term disabilities, short-term disabilities, health and welfare, morale activities. And that usually makes up another 8 to 10% in most companies. So I've taken the liberty of providing the percentages in two columns there. On the left is the minimum of those ranges I gave you. And on the right side are the maximums of those ranges that I gave you. And you can see on the left-hand side, if you add up the minimums for most of those three elements, for most companies anyway, it's about 26%. And 8% of that is the direct benefits. On the right side, it adds up to about 31.5%. And that's what traditionally we've seen in most government contractors. We've seen fringe rates that range between 30 and 32, 33, sometimes even 34%. It depends on the base, because lower salaries tend to have a higher fringe rate, higher salaries. It's a fraction. So if the denominator of that fraction is larger, then the percentage is smaller. It varies with company size. Lower rates are mostly in the smaller companies. In the larger companies, you see larger or higher rates. A little bit more about that gauge survey. We've been doing the gauge survey for 6 years now. This will be our 7th year. It's themed every year, and this year it was reimagining how we work. There are a lot of really good things in that report. I encourage you to go to our website and download it. In fact, I think at the end of this presentation, there's actually a QR code that'll let you download the report. Here's one of the tables in that report, and I outlined the fringe rates. You're welcome to take this table and study it, see how you compare to the averages in your size bands. But I'll call your attention to the leftmost size band in the annual revenue block. That's $0 to $10 million companies. The fringe rate average, and this is not a small sample. We had 1,150 companies respond to our survey this year, and 58% of them were in this size band. So that's well over 500 companies in this that made up this average, and the average came out to 20%. Now, you know how averages work. That means some companies were less than 20, some companies were more than 20. Average was around 20%. And of course, in the employee size block, again, the left-hand column, comes out to about 22%. And 1 to 99 employee companies usually fall in that 0 to 10 million size band, though a few go over into the next band because it doesn't take into account subcontractors. You'll notice for the 50 million and up, or the 100 employee and up companies, they're all about 31%. In fact, the 25 to 50 million band was 32%, just about where we expected it to be given my previous slide. See the right-hand column comes out to about 31.5, and that's right dead between the 25 to 50 and the $50 million companies. So what's happening in the 0 to 10 million size band? And the answer is, we don't know. It's a little bit of a mystery, but if payroll taxes are 10 to 11.5% and paid absence is 8 to 10%, that's 18 to 21% right there, which means that companies, average companies in that size band, aren't giving their employees any health insurance, no life insurance, no 401k contributions, no short-term disability, no long-term disability. Now you can't take a sample that small, even if it is 500 companies, and extend it to all of GovCon, because GovCon is very large. There are 10 or 12,000 companies that make up the whole population. But when I look at that number, I wonder to myself, how prevalent is that? And is it just a data anomaly? Is this just a point in time that really doesn't mean very much? And I'll let you come to your own conclusion. We've been, as I said, we've been doing this particular survey for 6 years, and we have data over time. We didn't ask these rate questions the first couple of years. We started asking them in 2019, and take a look at what happened to that bright blue bar. It started out over 35%. In fact, it was around 36% 4 years ago. It has dropped significantly, and this one is the overall average. Okay? It's dropped to about 26% over 4 years, and the drop hasn't been sudden. It hasn't gone up and down. It has dropped steadily, and it's dropped year after year until it has arrived where we are today at about 26%. And of course, if I did this for the under 10 million companies, it drops even more and goes even lower. So it's not a data anomaly. It's not data jitter caused by small samples. We know all the things it's not. What we don't know is why. And that's not the kind of thing you can get out of survey questions. We don't really know why. It could be companies experimenting with the gig economy, with independent contractors who get no benefits at all, and therefore have almost no fringe rate, and those zeros are averaging in with the higher rates for employees and giving us a lower average. Could be that. It could be small companies experimenting with recovering their fringe rates in other pools like overhead and G&A. That's not sustainable in the long run because DCA eventually will audit those rate pools and they will tell you that those costs are misclassified. They need to be moved to the fringe pool. I don't personally think that's it, but we don't really know why. It's a really interesting thing that's going on. And in the long run, it's not sustainable. And if this is a long-term trend, I think I may have put my finger kind of on the recruiting and retention problem, at least in smaller companies. The Gauge report, we're proud of this report. This is a super resource for companies that want to compare themselves to other companies like themselves. Please feel free to point your mobile device at that QR code, or when you download the presentation, this link will be active. You can click on this link and go straight to our website where you can download a copy of this report. It's really useful for figuring out who you are and how you're performing against companies of your size. I really appreciate your attention this afternoon. My name's Rich Wilkinson. I'm a Senior Industry Director of GovCon and Unanet. I've been doing GovCon for almost over 40 years now, almost 45 years. I started out as a Navy contracting officer at the Naval Air Systems Command. I spent 10 years in the controllership of mid-sized and larger companies in the Washington, D.C. area. And ever since then, I've been in the software business for two different companies and over 7 years now with Unanet, helping them navigate all the rules and regulations around government contracting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich, for your time and expertise. It was a truly great presentation today. We have a stellar lineup of guest speakers for our upcoming Government Contractor Chat webinar series. Craig Marino is going to be presenting Sensitive Compartmented Information Facilities. This will be the SCIF 101 session, Wednesday, April 19th. Bill Bolton will be presenting Cyber Liability, How It Impacts Your Business, Wednesday, May 17th. Toby Musser will be presenting Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, What It Is and Why It Matters, Wednesday, June 21st. You can scan the QR code on the screen to register for these webinars. Thank you for your time.